So this is really random. You wanna get a feel for how prominent murders seem to be in Portland way back in the day? Well, I literally just shot a video about the murder of a woman named Emma Helms, who was killed literally like right around these shrubs and whatnot, you know, 3 blocks away. She was killed on January 6th, 1907. I randomly am moving on to a new video from there, and I just looked at it and I noticed this particular case happened, or at least the event that occurred, happened January 7th, 1907. The very next day from when Emma Helms was killed. And interestingly enough, not too far away, because I'm on my way on foot to the site where this event happened. This is a really interesting one with a lot of mystery and suspicion. And all that said, hey, it's Steve the Amateur Historian, and in case you didn't notice, it's another episode of Historic Murders of Portland. These houses up here are absolutely astonishing. I mean, just everywhere you look, it's absolutely gorgeous in this area. This is the very schnazzy part of Goose Hollow, and actually very close to where today's video, or at least the preponderance of it, is going to take place. Love it here. Talk about one of your top places to want to own your own home. It's so nice over here. But today's video is about anything but the niceties in life. This is the story of Dr. Philip Edwards Johnson, who was a physician who had somewhat recently, at least as of January 1907, relocated to Portland from New York, where he planned to settle down and live out the rest of his life with his wife. And on the evening of January 7th, he seemed normal, seemed fine, everything seemed chill, even though I doubt that was a term back then. He had dinner with his wife. Apparently was in jovial mood, high spirits. He then went and visited the home of a friend who worked in the banking industry, which I'll get to in a bit because that actually has some prominence in this story. And after he left the home of his banker friend, which was just a couple blocks in this direction, he was on his way to meet another doctor colleague who lived due south this direction. So in order to cross to visit his friend, Dr. Johnson had to cross the Ford Street Bridge, which is no longer located here. This is the Vista Avenue Viaduct, which you will note was constructed in 1925, so 18 or so years after Dr. Johnson was passing through here. So before this bridge, it was the Ford Street Bridge. So Dr. Johnson would have been crossing that bridge to get to further what is now southwest Portland to visit his friends. Well, it appears while in this vicinity, Dr. Johnson was accosted. It was believed robbed. If he was a physician, he likely was a fairly well-to-do gentleman, or at least looked like he was fairly well-to-do. And he again, the presumption he was assaulted in some way and thrown off of the Ford Street Bridge all the way down to the ground below. So, in addition to the clear fact that, you know, Johnson's body was discovered way down here mangled, he'd obviously fallen from the bridge, they also found an empty pocketbook up here on the bridge, presumably taken from him, and, you know, searched for money. The doctor's pockets were empty, like his pockets had been searched, and the idea was maybe he started fighting back and a scuffle ensued that ultimately led in him getting pushed off the bridge to his death. Perhaps whoever accosted him and robbed him didn't want him as a living witness, and therefore it was kind of premeditated that it would end with him going off this bridge. But what's interesting is everybody publicly, newspapers, thought this was clearly a robbery and a murder. But even early on, police were kind of hinting at the possibility that this may have been a suicide, which really made no sense. The doctor had literally just located to this town to settle down and actually enjoy the rest of his life. Nobody saw any reason why he'd want to kill himself. He was in good spirits that night. And there was clear evidence that he had been robbed. They found, you know, his pocketbook up here. His pockets had been, you know, searched. It was obvious, it seemed, what happened. But for some reason, by January 9th, it hadn't even been 48 hours since the murder, the police said it was a suicide, and they completely closed the case. They reached their conclusion, and they decided that's the end of this investigation. Which is, you know, it's very tragic. I mean, here's a sign right here. It says, you know, we can help you cross this bridge, and then a number to a suicide hotline. There's a reason why there's fencing around this bridge, and it's because it's at such a high elevation. It's sadly a prime potential target for someone who would want to take their own life, because the viaduct here is so high above ground. It's over 100 feet, and there's nothing but concrete and street below. You're practically guaranteed to not survive a fall from this bridge. So, you know, the city's done the best they can to try to prevent people access. You know, even if you look over here, you know, there's concrete here, but it's mostly just kind of slinks downwards towards the street. And that was the conclusion that the authorities suddenly reached. It was really bizarre. And to add further fuel to the fire, just a couple of months after Dr. Johnson met his demise from this bridge, there was a woman who was discovered down at the base of the bridge, clearly had come from the top, and it was determined pretty quickly that hers was a suicide. But it is interesting to note that she, like Dr. Johnson, was another person who was from a fairly prominent, well-to-do family. But reportedly, she'd also been suffering depression for about a year leading up to when she apparently just woke up, walked to the bridge, and just jumped off. And there was apparently, I want to say, several months after that, in the vicinity of October, there was one or two more people that met their demise. So there was at least 4 people just in 1907 that met their deaths coming off this bridge. But Dr. Johnson's death was clearly a suspicious one, and even newspapers were reporting the moment the police said it's a suicide, over and done. Newspapers were saying, you know, oh, this is suspicious. This is interesting. Why would you shut a case when you have this kind of evidence? Why would you, in less than 48 hours, completely go against the evidence that exists, barely dedicating any time to really raw investigation, and ignoring the fact that there was no motive for Dr. Johnson to just take his life jumping off the bridge? He was out for the night visiting friends. He visited a banker friend. He was going to visit a doctor friend. there was no logistical reason for why he would want to jump, but by January 9th, 1907, the case was closed as far as authorities were concerned. And I'm going to try to, there's this kind of cool sitting area. I'm going to try to get up here without hurting myself to give you a view of really how high. Here's the bridge, and you look at how far down it goes to the street. I mean, when you're walking under this, it's really high off the ground. You can really see how far the grade goes down from here. So this case looms dead for several months. It's a suicide. That's it. Even though it seems everybody with half a brain is thinking, what the hell are the police thinking? But then something interesting happened. Now, as I said earlier, right before going to the 4th Street Bridge, Dr. Johnson visited a banking acquaintance of his. This was a person named W.C. Alvord. W.C. Alvord lived pretty much right here, right in the front yard of this big apartment called the Celio Apartments. Approximately, his home would have been like right here-ish. That's where Alvord's home would have been. So this was where Dr. Johnson was. Is the last place he was seen alive before heading southbound. Now everybody already knew these details, that this was the last place he was seen alive, but it didn't really seem to bear much credence because, you know, nobody suspected his banking friend of being involved in this, so what difference did it make? But again, it's several months after this case, or of, you know, this doctor presumably jumping off the bridge and taking his life, that the authorities start pursuing a gang of post office thieves, is how they're described. They apparently robbed post offices. I don't know, stealing checks, stealing people's personal information. I don't know what these guys were doing. But one of the guys who was busted was a guy named Frank Kelly, who started suggesting that there might be a connection between one of their head guys, a guy named Frank Wayne, that he might know a little bit something about what happened to Dr. Edwards. So all of a sudden, you know, the public's feeling vindicated. We knew it was a murder, and these post office thieves are gonna unveil it. But it was still very hearsay. It was still very like, we think maybe these guys know what happened. We think we might be able to solve it. This is very suspicious. Why is this Frank Kelly guy suddenly, you know, unveiling that he knows information about this thing that was reported as a suicide? You'd think if it was a suicide, you'd leave it alone. But for some reason, this guy started talking about it. And ultimately, 2 women who lived in this vicinity were shown a picture, or no, I don't think it was shown a picture. They actually saw they either saw the men in person or they saw pictures of the 2 men. My brain is forgetting at this moment. And immediately identified them as men they had seen loitering and prowling in this area, in the vicinity of where W.C. Alvord lived, the last place Dr. Johnson was seen alive. And these guys were Frank Wayne, who was again one of the top guys in the group, and another guy named Charles Anderson. They were both seen loitering specifically in the vicinity of where Alvord lived. So you wonder, 2 fairly prominent thieves with staunch criminal records with a focus in robbery, which we want to believe that's what happened to Dr. Johnson, and they're just loitering in this area around the time that this guy is seen there and then vanishes. So you start to think, these women identify these men, and you got Dr. Johnson walking out of Alvord's home and going this way, and 2 robbers are right there. And so theoretically, from the vicinity of Dr. Alvord's house, which is right down here, it's probable that Dr. Johnson would have started heading south in this direction. You go right up here, it turns, goes right into Vista Avenue, and that's where the Vista Avenue Viaduct is, which was the Ford Street Bridge at one time. He could have cut up to Vista Avenue, but this was just such a nicer way to go. So, a new theory kind of takes shape when you think it's in all likelihood Frank Wayne and Charles Anderson were planning on pulling a bank robbery of some kind. And here they are loitering around the home of somebody who works at a bank. And it just happens to be the person who Dr. Johnson is visiting. So the idea can be approached that these two guys are scoping out the house, you know, waiting for an opportunity to harass, rob, whatever, in the case of W.C. Alvord. And Dr. Johnson leaves. And, you know, it seems like it's evening time, so maybe they can't see the guy well. You know, maybe they're trying to be inconspicuous, so they're following him from behind. They don't really get a good look at his face, and they start following him as he's going from where Alvord lived, which was just a couple blocks this way. And, you know, following Dr. Johnson, again, thinking he's somebody else. And following him till they have that opportunity, which could have been on the Ford Street Bridge when it was here. They come up, they attack, they accost him. One of the old newspapers suggested once they started accosting him and robbing him, they saw him, maybe they knew what Alvord looked like, and then saw that it was somebody else, and either angry that they got the wrong person or panicked because they got the wrong person, they were like, we have to get rid of this guy, and threw him off the bridge. Just as well, it could have been a scuffle. Dr. Johnson could have fought back and led to that happening. There's any number of possibilities that could happen, but now suddenly, you know, it flashes new light on this case, and all of a sudden there's a new idea that's backed by circumstantial evidence and eyewitness accounts. It's not completely, you know, etched in stone that this is what happened, but suddenly you have evidence pointing to people who were in all the right places at the wrong time. And you start to wonder, why did the authorities slam the case closed on this one so much? And one possibility, I'm not going to say this is why it was suddenly deemed a suicide and wiped off, like, you know, the police wanted this case to disappear, is the fact that Wayne and Anderson and this gang that they ran with, they were, I don't really know how this works, but they were post office thieves. They robbed post offices. They both went up for robbing the post office in Selwood, which is southeast Portland, just across the Willamette River. And they'd also gotten busted for robbing the Gresham post office, which Gresham is just, you know, due east of Portland. And, you know, messing with the postal service, messing with the mail, that's a federal crime. And it could be that these guys came under fire somewhat quick, but the feds who were after these guys, they didn't want these guys going down for some little robbery, murder, you know, attempted robbery of someone who may or may have not been connected to a bank. They wanted these guys on the bigger beef. That happens a lot. You know, people will commit an obvious crime right in public, and the authorities won't do anything about it. And the reason they won't do anything about it is because they're trying to bust these guys on another crime of some kind that's much bigger, that they can do more time for. And if you bust them for this small thing, it can have adverse effects on your ability to bust them for the bigger stuff later on. You always hear that about, you know. Or there's the reversal, where you're never going to get them on the big stuff, so you get them on whatever you can. You know, Al Capone went to prison for tax evasion. It was what they could get him for. So that's a possible theory as to why the authorities just in such bizarre fashion just decided, hey, we're just going to call this a suicide, despite the evidence, despite the fact they had not given due time to investigate this thing, and the fact that there was no motive and no evidence to say that this was a suicide, other than the fact that it was a bridge that people had used to commit suicide from before. It's crazy. It's really bizarre. And based on this new evidence that came out, you know, way after Dr. Johnson's death, way after the authorities said it was a suicide, and that's it. My personal conviction is I think Frank Wayne and Charles Johnson did it based on the information provided, based on the fact that, you know, what are the odds that they would just happen to be casing a house where this is the last place Dr. Johnson is seen alive, and these guys were loitering, casing the place, and then suddenly Dr. Johnson, a guy who has no reason to take his own life, turns up dead. What are the odds? And it also needs to be noted that Frank Wayne and Charles Anderson, neither man was, it seems, unless it went completely unreported, which seems incredibly unlikely, it doesn't seem either man was actually officially charged for robbery and murder in the case of Dr. Johnson. All I was able to find was that they were sent to prison for the, you know, federal crimes they committed and post office robbery, and that Frank Wayne was given, I believe, a 9 or 10 year sentence, and he was actually released after 3 years to great disgust from the general public. And it seems like, even the newspaper suggested this, that it seemed like both these men were a little too quick to just admit their guilt to these robberies, which were federal crimes. You'd think you'd want to fight that. And they think part of the reason they did that was so that they would just go on, so that they would just go through and get charged with that, and the issue of Dr. Johnson's mysterious death wouldn't even come up, and they would completely avoid that, because they probably figured a beef for post office robberies probably a lot less than a beef for murder. So people have found that very suspicious, and that Frank Wayne and Charles Anderson were only all too happy to just admit to what they'd done in terms of these cases that were going to get them pretty serious sentences. So that's suspicious as well. So I have to, you know, put an asterisk next to the term solved in this case, but I think it was these two guys, all things considered. And that's where I stand on this one. You can let me know where you stand. These articles can still be found online. You can do your own investigating and come back and be like, Steve, you're an idiot. There's no way these guys did it. I mean, I'll probably delete your comment because I'm petty that way. But no, seriously, I mean, one of the things I like about these stories, especially the ones where the final conclusion is not wholly set in stone, is that there's room for discussion and analysis. And I'm sure people out there watching my video might pick up things on this case that I didn't notice. So I'm always interested in hearing what people have to say in cases where there's still wiggle room, still room for doubt. So let me know what you think, guys. And that's it. Till next time. Remember, like, share, subscribe, comment, again, if you so desire. And hit up my Patreon if you want to help me financially. Most appreciated. And all that said, till next time. From Goose Hollow, the general region where suspicious activities were going on. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if this is the way that Dr. Johnson walked. As I said, as I showed earlier, the 1907 murder of Dr. Philip Edwards Johnson. All spurned from this beautiful neighborhood. You'd never think anything bad would happen around here. It's so freaking gorgeous all around. I'm geeking out on the architecture. Anyway, till next time. There is a cobweb on my camera. I hope that is not ruining my video. Till next time, Steve the Amateur Historian. This has been an episode of Historic Murders of Portland.